We are ready for our next session, the Shia Revival with Vali Nasr, introduced by Jonathan Shainin. It's presented by Amity University. So let's welcome Vali Nasr and Jonathan Shainin on stage for this wonderful, informative session. And while they are being mic'd up, all of you, if you can just take one message home with you from this Jaipur Literature Festival, Banega Swachh India. Let's make India clean, let's make India Swachh. Go back with this message from this Jaipur Literature Festival, my most favorite ad in the festival.
All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the last day of the 9th Jaipur Literature Festival. I'm Jonathan Shainin. I am very happy to be joined here by Vali Nasr. Vali is the Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He was an advisor to Richard Holbrooke and worked on Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's the author of many books, including The Shia Revival, which we're about to discuss right now, a book called The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in Retreat, a book called Forces of Fortune, whose subtitle, I believe, is The Rise of a New Muslim Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World. And of course, we're here to talk today about the Shia Revival, and I think the events of recent weeks and months and recent years in the Middle East are going to give us no shortage of material. So I'm going to begin by asking Vali about this book, which was published in 2006, called The Shia Revival. So I want you to tell us a bit about what you were seeing in the run-up to this, the writing of this book, that led you to think, okay, there is something happening that I'm going to call a Shia Revival. And what was this Shia Revival that you're describing?
Well, once the Iraq War happened, you know, the narrative about the Iraq War was about bringing democracy to Iraq. But in divided societies, democracies produce winners and losers. And in the Middle East, even on the run-up of the Iraq War, there was many instances in which it was very clear that there is resistance to giving Shias a voice. For instance, when the first Iraq War happened, after Saddam Hussein was pushed out of Kuwait, there was a massive Shia uprising in southern Iraq that was actually put down with the death of about 300,000 Shias in southern Iraq, which actually explains a lot of their anger. But for me, you know, this actually came home when I was a graduate student in South Asia. I worked in Pakistan and I spent time in Lucknow, and this was at the height of you know, the sort of enthusiasm for the Iranian Revolution, and it was very clear that there was a sort of a proxy war going out in India and Pakistan between Shias and Sunnis, and essentially between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the polemics were coming out of seminaries, and the money went back to Saudi Arabia. And this notion that the Sunnis in particular are extremely sensitive to any kind of a political development, like an Iranian revolution, like an invasion of Iraq, like an Arab Spring, that could change the balance of what we used to see from the West from afar, which is when we say Islam, we really are talking about Sunnis, essentially. And when we say the Arab world, we're really talking about the Sunnis. That any kind of a disturbance in this sort of structure is bound to produce massive reaction. And the reaction that I saw firsthand in Pakistan and India, and actually in Pakistan is still ongoing in the form of sectarian violence, was bound to happen in the Arab world, that the Arab world was not going to take kindly to any kind of a change in order. And let's not forget, one of the most important outcomes of the Iraq war, and if you're a Shia in the Middle East, you look at this very differently than the Sunnis, is that it created the first Shia Arab state, modern state. And that was bound to be...
This is contemporary Iraq.
Contemporary Iraq. But you know, so I was, looking at the background in South Asia, I thought this was coming. As a scholar, you know, I thought it was my duty to put it on the table because I thought the narrative on the Iraq War was very different. And the fact that particularly where I lived in America, there was very little sense of what are these Shias and Sunnis. We thought they're all Muslims or they're all Iraqis. And so what is with that? And the Shia Revival is an effort to show why this would be a political problem.
So let's go back to the beginning, as it were. I was saying to you before, there is particularly in America, but this is a broad thing, I think, throughout the West, there is a sort of tendency, I say, to ancientize these conflicts, right? You saw this even in Yugoslavia. In the 1990s, there was a sense that, you'd read in American newspapers, look, these people are divided by ancient hatreds, and what can we do about it? And, Vali has recently wrote an article in Foreign Policy where he talks about how Obama, in his last State of the Union address, made this reference to the fact that the Middle East is rooted in conflicts that date back millennia, so look, what can we do, right? As I said, it's like if someone came to America and said, there's ancient hatred between white Americans and black Americans that goes back many centuries, and they'll just never have peace. So, Vali, let's actually go back to the split, but without spending too much time on the difference between Sunni and Shia. Could you talk a little bit about in the 1,000 years since there was this split within Islam, how kind of this sense of sectarianism began to develop, how these separate practices evolved?
But I mean, first of all, I think what you said suggests that history does matter, and importance of history doesn't mean we should throw our hands up and say, well, we can't do anything about it. But I really understand that history is really prologue to the future and to what is happening, and that's very true of the Middle East. Well, the basics of this split between Shiites and Sunnis is very simple. When Prophet Muhammad died, there was not immediately, but gradually within the first decades after his death, there was a disagreement over how the community should have chosen his successor. And the successor in Islam matters because the Prophet was both prophet and ruler of the Muslim community. So it wasn't just choosing a spiritual heir, it was to choose the person who would be also the ruler of the Islamic domains. And the Sunnis thought that along tribal custom, the most senior qualified person among his followers should be chosen as the caliph or his successor. The Shiites believe that it should run in the family of the Prophet. I always say, the Shiites understand the plot of the book, the Da Vinci Code, very well. It's all about the bloodline. And the Shiites obviously lost that battle. The caliphate ended up being in the hands of the Sunnis, and the Shiites remained dissidents at least till the 9th century. But that's only the beginning. It's kind of like when a crack happens, then it sort of opens up in different ways. Over the millennia, the Shiites and Sunnis have very different approach to faith, have very different approach to theology, have very different interpretation of every single page of the Quran. They both believe in the Quran, but they have a very different approach. The Shiites at the popular level, the religion is about passion. I mean, it's somewhat similar to Sufism in South Asia. It's a direct relationship with saints, and Shiites view that saints could be intermediaries between man and God. The everyday practice and beliefs of Shiites are very different from Sunnis. But more importantly, Islam is a religion of practice. You're not a Muslim by faith, you're a Muslim by practice, and practice is governed by law. And the Shiites have a very different school of law. When it comes to family law, inheritance rules, there are differences. So over time, the original split, it appears to be over something trivial, which is succession.
Right.
But over time, they've developed as very different interpretations of Islam. So, we cannot just dismiss it, nor you can gloss over and say, well, we're all Muslims, and we all believe in the same book, and we all believe in the same principles. Yes, we do, but the devil lies in the details. It's about interpretation, and the Shiites and Sunnis have very different interpretations of law and theology.
So when we look at conflicts over identity, right, anywhere in the modern world, whether that's nationalism, whether it's Hindu-Muslim conflict in India, whether it's the Sunni-Shiite, conflict in the Middle East, You have on the one hand the existence of these differences, which, if you've just said, are consecrated in practice and evolve over 1,000 years. But then the differences, so to speak, have to be operationalized, right? A political leader or a spiritual leader has to say, you're a Shia, that guy's a Sunni, go get him, kind of thing. So what I wanted to ask you about, you talk in the Shia Revival about the idea that bringing us closer to the present, one of the first things that started to kind of grind these gears of sectarianism in the 20th century is the advent of modern Islamism. So can you talk a bit about, and this is during an era of Sunni Arab nationalism as well, right? So walk us through a little bit, the first half of the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century. How does the development of Islamism, the Maududi, who you've written a book about, start to operationalize or reopen some of this sectarian conflict?
Right. So first of all, let me say that secularism does not mean that Muslims or followers of any other religion are tolerant of other minorities. So even in the Arab world, sectarianism was practiced, without calling it that, by Ba'athist leftist governments. I mean, Saddam Hussein established, and same with the Assad family in Syria, established actual sectarian states that privilege the minority over majority, and these majorities were based on religion. So this is not about faith alone. This is embedded in the structure of this.
In this era of what we came to believe was secular Arab nationalism, Nasr in Egypt, exactly. Assad in Syria, Saddam, these were sectarian states still.
These were sectarian states still, and these are also very scared states, because a state that is built on loyalty of 25% of the population, by definition, has to deploy enormous amount of repression to control the other, 80% of the population. And the sin of the United States in 2003 is to deprive the Iraqi state of the ability to continue that sectarian suppression. So whereas the Sunnis in the Arab world see the Iraq war, and that's the narrative we hear, as an imperialist act that destroyed an Arab country, for many Shiites in the region, whatever America sinned, it did liberate them. It did give them the ability to take over the state. And in many ways, if I may draw a very rough parallel, when at the time of the partition, the Muslims in India were a minority.
Right.
So the entire process of decolonization empowered the majority, and the minority obviously didn't like the outcome, and it led to convulsions that divided the subcontinent. But the majority believed that actually that should have been the writ of history. Now, having said that, Islamic fundamentalism, which actually grew initially as Sunni fundamentalism,
right,
both in the form of Jamaat-e-Islami and Maududi in India and Pakistan, and in the form of Muslim Brotherhood, is based on defining who's a good Muslim, and then building a state on the basis of proper practice of Islam. Once you go down that path, you have to say, okay, what is a Muslim and who's a Muslim?
So you can't have an ecumenical Islamism, because Islamism means we're organizing a state along lines of proper Islamic practice.
Look, fundamentalists are people who don't believe even most of the Sunnis are proper Muslims. They don't know those Shiites which are on the fringes. I remember Maududi famously wrote that Shiites were misguided Muslims, that they had misinterpreted history, and if they listened to me and read my works, they would come to the right path. Now, Maududi wasn't violent that way, but Maududi's children have increasingly become more and more intolerant. And so when you arrive at this sort of hardline extremism today, which we associate with Salafism and Wahhabism, they're not interested in education. They're interested in clearing very clear black and white lines about where Islam begins and where Islam ends. As I said, most Sunnis and Sufis don't fit in their definition of an Islam, let alone the Shiites. So the rise of fundamentalism, and Iran's fundamentalism as well, really has put on the table the question, who's inside the society and who's outside the society. So, fundamentally, and in a region like the Middle East, where Islam matters so much in public political discourse, it's very difficult to think of how you can have a cosmopolitan definition of society that is inclusive of, Sufis and Shiites and Alawites and Alavis and all these other sects. And so the problem of sectarianism has become much bigger problematic in the region. If I may give an example, when General Zia-ul-Haq became president of Pakistan, he declared an Islamic state in a very sort of a lofty way. And he said, well, once you have a state that is Islamic, all citizenry should pay the religious taxes to the state. And the Shia said, not so fast. We don't recognize, a Sunni state, and we don't recognize Pakistan's state as, including us, and we don't accept its laws, and we want to continue to give our religious taxes to our own clerics. And to make the point, they brought 1 million people to Islamabad in February 1979. They shut down the capital. It helped them that Khomeini was in power in Iran. Zia backed off, essentially accepting that the Islamic state in Pakistan is a Sunni state. It's not a Shia state.
So, i.e., it can't take religious taxes from the Shia.
Right, and that actually made a lot more Pakistanis with means to declare themselves Shias, which actually was not welcome.
So you've walked very nicely into my next question, which was, okay, so we have this period of Sunni Arab nationalism. Islamism comes up in part as a response to that, starts to burn the sectarian embers a little bit, and then, you have this explosive event in the history of sectarianism in the modern Middle East, which is the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which, as you just referred to, had, immediately had an impact because the Shia of Pakistan feel empowered. So talk about what happened in, not the actual revolution in 1979, but what the impact of that revolution was on the Sunni and Shia perception of power in the region.
Well, the Iranian revolution was ambiguous in the sense that it was a Shia revolution. Even the symbolisms Khomeini used, the language he used, the ideas of martyrdom, revolution, these were immediately recognizable by Shias everywhere. But they also were immediately not recognizable by the Sunnis. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya famously said, what is this thing called an Ayatollah that Iran has 82 of it and we don't have any? Even the way Khomeini looked to most Sunnis was very clear that he doesn't look like a Sunni cleric. Now, on Shias in the region, this was an empowering phenomenon. First of all, because they looked and saw that Sunni fundamentalists are sort of the vanguard of the revolutionary movement in the Arab world. They're the ones who sort of boast about being now the main voice of revolution. And guess what? It's a Shia that actually carried out what they were promising everybody.
So what Nasr has promised, what Assad has
what
promised.
Muslim Brotherhood was promising, and what
I see. Right.
The leader of Jamaat Islami, Maududi, said, I wish it was me who carried out the first Islamic revolution. Now, if you're a Shia in Pakistan, and you see all of these Islamic fundamentalists with Jamaat Islami have been talking about Islamic State and Islamic revolution and how this is important, but they're not the ones who carried it out.
Okay.
It was the Shias. So the Shias almost felt they were going from the back of the line to the front of the line. And the Sunnis, on the other hand, were impressed by what Khomeini did. They wanted to emulate it. They respected him as a political leader, especially in kicking the West in the shin, but they never accepted him as a leader of their own. So Khomeini, the rest of his time was, and still the case with the Islamic Republic in Iran, is desperately trying to say, we're a universal Islamic republic. We're a universal Islamic movement. But what they get in return is that the Sunnis say, no.
You're Shia.
You're Shia.
Well, you write in the book that, it's always been, I don't know how much they still care about this, right? But from the beginning, the orthodoxy of the Iranian Revolution has been that we're going to export this revolution around the world. And you write, really what prevented this was sectarianism, right? It's not, that they wanted to spread this, but in Pakistan or in Southeast Asia, there's no take-up for it.
There was no take-up for it. I mean, like every revolution, like Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, there's a sort of a Marxist, universalist side to the Iranian Revolution as well. And it did want to sort of give the gift of what it did in Iran to others. And it also played into the whole promise of Islamic fundamentalism, that one day Islam will triumph over the secular state and it will build a perfect Islamic state. Now, the way this stopped is that Sunni clerics, particularly funded by Iran's main adversaries in the Persian Gulf, basically created a firewall. So when I was in Lucknow, the seminaries in Lucknow were putting out books that basically said all Shiites are unbelievers. It's not that they're deviants or we can coexist. These guys are kafirs, or Rafidis, which are people who have rejected the truth of Islam. And basically, Khomeini has no authority or legitimacy to say anything. And if you're a Sunni, you wouldn't listen to him. And it was effective. It was effective in gradually sort of getting the Sunnis to think of the Iranian revolution as a Shia threat, rather than as a sort of an all-embracing, sort of a universal Islamic movement. So the Iranians found that, in Pakistan, where there were massive uprisings of Shias, and there was some also in northern India, that it was very quickly quashed by a much more powerful Sunni reaction. So this happened, and then there was a series of bombings of one another's clerics off of their pulpits on Friday prayer mosques in Pakistan, the Shias killing the Sunni ones and the Sunnis killing the Shia ones. But in the end, Iran found out that in a country like Pakistan, where 80% of the population is Sunni, it's not going to win. And then they resorted to trying to egg on coups and militias. But for all effective purposes, if you now look at the 35-year history of the Iranian revolution, it has minimal religious impact
outside of Iran.
In any Sunni environment.
Right.
I mean, what it's gained in the 35 years is for the government of Malaysia to actually pass a law that being a Shia is against the law.
I see. So it's been counterproductive in this regard.
It's been counterproductive. In Nigeria, that any Muslim Brotherhood person is, the best way the government can deal with Muslim Brotherhood is actually to call him Shia. Right. Which is like the double curse, because that legitimizes clamping down on him. But in a way, the Islamic Revolution in Iran failed in its goal of going anywhere beyond the Shia community.
So now I want us to jump through the 70s and 80s and 90s, and we come to the Iraq War. And what I think is interesting here, when I was growing up in America in the 1980s, and of course you've seen a lot of discussion of this looking back at the time of 9/11, because of the Iranian Revolution and because of the rivalry between the US and Iran, and then because of Hezbollah in Lebanon, you had a situation in America where there was this sense in the 80s that the Shia were really bad guys, right? There was this idea, which clearly is coming in part from America's Sunni allies in the Middle East, that, these people, they're these messianic lunatics, they're waiting for this crazy missing imam to come back, they're capable of anything, they're suicide bombers, all of this stuff. And then, of course, 9/11 comes along, and you imagine a lot of people in America started to think, wait, hang on, which are the Sunni and the Shia again? This is like, and so, when the Iraq War happens, what we're seeing is a shift in a perception of, who the Sunni and who the Shia are, and what the West is going to do about that. What is the way that, well, you tell me, when the U.S. goes into Iraq, what do they think they're doing?
Right. Well, just as a prelude to that, it's true, the Iranians and Hezbollah and their minions were bad guys. I mean, they actually, in many ways, they actually thought that being a bad guy was the element of their power. So, Khomeini understood that, okay, you can't convince the Sunni world to follow you religiously, but if you're the toughest group against Israel, that has an appeal to the Arab masses that preaching, Islam to them doesn't.
Sure, right.
So they sort of double down on being the most ferocious anti-Western and anti-Israeli.
So you might not be able to export the Iranian Revolution theologically, but you can have Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, and he fights the Israelis, and maybe the Sunnis of other parts of the region will come to admire him because he's a tough guy.
There is a poll, I think in 2007, that was taken in Egypt. This is after the Iranian president called for wiping Israel off the map, and Hezbollah went to war with Israel. And you have to note, Hezbollah is the only Arab army who has actually defeated Israel on the battlefield, something that none of the other Sunni armies can. So the poll showed that the three most people the capital of Arab nationalism, and the most important city in the Arab world respected in order were Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Khalid Mashal of Hamas, and Hassan Nasrallah. 2 Shias, 1 Iranian.
Right. And Khalid Mashal, who at that time was funded by Iran, right?
Was funded by Iran. So for Iran, definitely, this became gradually part of its modus operandi in the region. That power rested in being with the masses. The masses are angry, so being anti-Western, anti-American works. And actually, that's why this decision by Iran to sign the nuclear deal is such a major shift in position. The Iraq War, was despite whatever conspiracy theorists say, in the end was not about empowering the Shias. Was about sort of changing the face of the region, bringing democracy. All of these things we can criticize, but in the end, its unintended consequences came to be its most significant legacy, which is when you remove a Sunni government and destroy its 2 main apparatuses of power, which are the Iraqi army and the Ba'ath Party. And mind you, I can fully understand why the Shiites were asking for destruction of these 2 institutions. Exactly,
they had been at the forefront of persecuting Shia.
Because they would have been the basis for a Sunni return to power. I mean, the Shiites fully understand there would be a military coup at some point by a Sunni officer, and backed by the money coming from the outside, there would be a Sunni restoration. There's been an obsession with preventing a Sunni return to power among the Shiites, which has been unproductive. So then, and you have elections, but guess who's going to vote?
The majority.
The majority, yeah. And whatever way you cut it, they're going to form the government. The Shiites are about 65% of Iraq, 85% of Arab Iraq. I mean, if you count the Kurds out, this is an absolute majority that basically was being ruled by a minority government. So it created the first Shia state. And if you went back to before the Iraq War and you stood back, this region was really managed by an alliance of America and authoritarian Sunni rulers, right? And this was built after 1979, largely to keep the revolutionary anti-Western Shia Iran out of the region. So the Iraq War was, and the Arab rulers say this, was an act of betrayal, because the United States came in, took a sledgehammer to the foundation of this alliance by bringing, a government that obviously was misbehaving and was dangerous and had invaded Kuwait, but was keeping the Shias in a box.
Right.
The United States brought that regime down and then handed this country to the Shias. So the minute Iraq became Shia, the notion of a solid American Sunni alliance was gone. It's kind of, it's been flowing on what we call, it's been flowing on fumes since 2006.
Right.
And now the recent Iran nuclear deal is really an end to that, the notion that that alliance is still there.
Something I wanted you to talk about was the way in which, if we start with the Iraq War again, you have kind of the way that within the region, both at this big level of geopolitics, state by state, but also among the populations of the region, the Iraq War, you sort of see 2 things happening, both of which sort of fuel further sectarianism. The first one is what you're just describing, right? Which is that you have this empowered Shia community now, and you have, what used to be a Sunni state in the regional order is now effectively a Shia state. But the other thing that you see happening, and it happened after the Iraq War, and we're now seeing it in Syria and in Yemen and in other places, is you have an explosion of violence after a war like this, and all of a sudden that sectarian violence in one country starts to reverberate throughout the whole region. So you start to have Sunnis in other countries seeing their people killed by Shia, Shia death squads in Baghdad, and you start to have Shia in other countries seeing Sunnis coming in, blowing up, mosques and things like that. And all of a sudden, it's like once the sectarian fire is lit in Iraq, it can't be contained. Now you start to have these little outbreaks of it all over the rest of the region.
Well, yes. I mean, the simple answer to this is that the politics in the heart of the Middle East is communal, right? Communities live together when they're under some kind of structure break. For what happened, community. It was that they was going to go and this you had the beginning of sort of communal politics, and particularly more by coming next. So the Middle East does not have representative. It doesn't managed by authoritarian states, top down, and once you sort of remove them, then you had a competition, became very communal quickly. So the Shias were holding a grudge against Saddam. There was retributions, without a doubt, of holding every Sunni as responsible for what a Sunni regime had done to them. The Sunnis saw the Shiites as vindictive. There was this sense that I guess maybe Muslims in India also had, of a right to rule historically, and not being reconciled to giving it up. The Sunnis are the more educated in Iraq. They held power. They held the benefits. They're not very happy with this sort of Shias. A lot of them coming from the slums.
But Shias in Iraq, the Sunnis in Iraq tend to see the Shia as kind of working class, hard scrabble, vulgar, unpolished kind of is right. That's the caricature.
And that's the caricature there. It's the caricature also in Bahrain. It's the caricature in Lebanon.
Yeah.
It's the caricature in Saudi Arabia. They're sort of at the bottom of society. Now their numbers have grown exactly because they're at the bottom of society, and wars have shifted their places. So the Iran-Iraq war caused millions of Shias to end up in Baghdad. So Baghdad became actually a Shia city. The Israeli wars in Lebanon, moved millions of Shias to Beirut.
Right.
So South Beirut became a Shia enclave. But the reality of it is that also, besides that, the rule in the heartland of the Arab world is a Sunni prerogative. It was under the Umayyad Caliphate, under Abbasid Caliphate, under the Ottoman Caliphate. The idea that Shiites would, and that's why ISIS's notion of restoring Sunni power through Caliphate has political resonance.
Right.
But the fact of it is that it didn't end, and it was still brewing. And you're right. So the Alawites looked at what happened to the Sunnis in Iraq, and they said, we're not giving power. And the Sunni monarchy in Bahrain looked at what happened in Iraq, and he said, we're not giving on power. And in the meantime, the majorities, the Sunnis in Syria or the Shiites in Bahrain, thought, why shouldn't they have what the Shiites in Iraq got? Let's have an election. Let's remove authoritarianism and go to the polls, and we, like those Shiites in Iraq, will end up the government. So, ever since Arab Spring has happened, and my view is that Arab Spring did to the rest of the Arab world what the United States Army did to Iraq, which is broke down the state and created this opportunity potentially to have the same kind of contestation. So, the minorities are desperately trying to avoid the elections in Iraq.
Right.
And the majorities in the societies want exactly the elections that transferred power in Iraq. So the majorities in Syria or Bahrain are telling the United States, why don't you do for us what you did for Iraqi Shias? And the minorities are saying, stay away, because we don't want you to do for the majority what you did for the majority in Iraq.
So I want to bring us up now to the events of the last year, I suppose, or more recently than that, and talk about the Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict, or the rivalry that now really seems to be driving things in the Middle East. But I think let's take a few steps to get there. For, 40-some years, as you said earlier, there has been a U.S. Sunni alliance in the Middle East that goes from Camp David stroke Iranian Revolution. And the sort of linchpin of this alliance is a relationship that goes back even farther, which is between the U.S. and the House of Saud. So how are the Saudis have been a kind of American partner, so to speak, although often a troublesome partnership on both sides, and they don't like what they're seeing right now.
Well, it's a paradox of history that Saudi Arabia is the only country that the United States is responsible for its existence.
Right.
Again, by commission, not by commission, but by sort of, it just so happens. So, when oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia and the British were busy with Iran and Iraq, it was American oil companies that showed up in Saudi Arabia and made a pact with the House of Saud that will give you this much royalties, etc. So in a way, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia predates the relationship between the United States and Israel in many ways. And it's sort of a longest running, if you would, partnership in.
So he can answer it.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about young Iranians?
Well, you know, I don't like actually this terminology, because in the Middle East everybody's young. You know, in fact, you have to.
No, sure. But this idea, I mean, I think what she was getting at eventually was the idea that, you know, 40 years after the Iranian Revolution, you have a younger generation that, like everywhere in the Middle East, but, you know, specific to Iran, is modernizing, has, you know, a fondness for the West, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, let me put it this way. You know, by and large, fundamentalism doesn't have an appeal in Iran. In other words, in Iran, the slogan that you hear in the Arab world, that Islam is the solution, doesn't fly, because they have Islam. So whatever problems they have is not going to be solved by Islam. It has to be solved by something else. Iranians go from being absolutely secular and opposed to religion, to having a notion of a Jeffersonian democracy where church and state ought to be, mosque and state ought to be separate, to having people who sympathize with the Islamic Republic or sympathize with the Islamic Republic but have political, you know, criticisms of it. But, you know, the facts that matter are the following. That, you know, it's a country in which literacy is about 85%. That more women go to universities than men do. That, you know, for instance, the first female to win the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in mathematics internationally, the Field Prize, is an Iranian woman, graduate at an Iranian university. That you have enormous amount of infrastructure. For instance, Iran has over 120,000 kilometers of natural gas pipeline. You don't have poverty in the sense of massive absence of basic social services for the population. You know, in other words, it's a country that is very ready, if you would, to engage. And again, you know, in terms of practice, you know, Iran doesn't have good democracy, and particularly at the national level, we know that. But 80% of Iran's municipal authorities are elected with access to their own budget. Now, those elections in little villages are not about the supreme leader and America. It's about actual exercise of democracy by who's gonna clean the streets and who's gonna dig the water pipe. So its profile is very different from its neighbors to the east and to the west. The only thing that needs to happen is an opening that would basically bring this energy into transformation of the country and engaging it into the global economy.
We've got to leave it there. Vali, are you going to sign some books? Is that?
I promise.
Vali will be doing a book signing. Thank you very much. Big hand for Vali Nasr.
A big round of applause.